All right, let's open up the pages of Volume 2 of Luisa Piccarretta's writings. Now, right off the bat, this isn't some dry theological textbook. It's an incredibly intimate memoir of total surrender. What we're looking at is a raw, day-by-day account of a soul navigating a mystical relationship with the divine and documenting what has to be the most intense spiritual journey imaginable. So what actually compels a soul to expose its absolute most agonizing, hidden secrets to the entire world? That's really the driving tension of this whole text. In today's explainer, we're diving into this fierce internal struggle between human reluctance and absolute divine love. We're going to explore how a person, someone completely terrified of public exposure, was pushed by what she believed to be an obedience to a higher calling to lay her soul completely bare. You see this right away in her very first diary entry. The entry from February 28, 1899, does not start with some triumphant shout of spiritual victory. Actually, it begins with extreme personal embarrassment. She writes, "I confess the truth. I feel great repugnance. The effort I have to make in order to conquer myself is so great that the Lord alone can know the torture of my soul." I mean, she is literally agonizing over her confessor's command to write all these visions down. She just feels entirely unworthy and completely terrified. But then there's this profound shift. She records Jesus' tender response to her panic. He asks, "What do you fear? Have I not assisted you the other times? My light will surround you everywhere." It's this really beautiful moment of reassurance. The text shows us that through the power of obedience, her paralyzing human fears actually begin to melt away, completely enveloped by a divine comfort that promises to guide her pen. And that sets up this fascinating, clear contrast that runs throughout the diary: human reluctance on one side and holy obedience on the other. Luisa is constantly wrestling with these dark, muddy feelings of personal unworthiness. She feels like a shadow, like absolute nothingness. But that reluctance is continually met and ultimately won over by the blinding, beautiful light of divine obedience. The text suggests that submitting to this obedience is exactly what unlocks her profound mystical experiences. So how does she define the core concepts that pull her through this? Let's start with faith. According to her revelation, faith isn't just some intellectual belief or a checklist of rules. She defines faith as God himself. She writes that just as material food physically sustains your body and becomes part of it, faith is the spiritual nourishment that feeds the soul. When a soul consumes this faith, it literally shares in the substance of the divine, fundamentally transforming the person to resemble God. And she uses this absolutely vivid analogy to show how a soul filled with that kind of faith interacts with the world. Imagine a person who literally possesses millions upon millions in riches, just entire kingdoms. Now, what if someone walked up and offered them a single muddy cent? What would they do? They'd completely disdain it, right? They wouldn't even give it a second glance. The text explains that a soul living in true faith views earthly attachments and material wealth exactly like that muddy cent, completely unappealing compared to the immense riches they already possess in the divine. So how does a soul with that perspective actually navigate the real world? Well, she gives us another great metaphor for this: the timid bird. To avoid spiritual snares and the traps of worldly attachments, the faithful soul acts like a hyper-cautious bird. Step 1, it dwells in high places, spiritually speaking. Step 2, when it absolutely must deal with earthly things, like getting food, it descends really quickly. And Step 3, it flies straight back up immediately to swallow it safely in the heights. It's a brilliant strategy for intense spiritual preservation. But here's the catch. To live in those high places, you actually have to start at the absolute bottom. And that brings us to humility. I just love this striking visual from the text. She defines humility as the littlest plant imaginable. It is totally grounded in an absolute recognition of one's own smallness and nothingness. But here's the paradox. Because it's so small and deeply rooted in truth, its branches grow so high they reach heaven and wind their way entirely around the throne of God. True greatness here has to start from absolute smallness. There is, however, a massive trap here, and she points it out perfectly with this quote: "Humility without confidence is false virtue." This is absolutely crucial to understand. Seeing our own misery and smallness shouldn't lead us to despair or discouragement. If you just feel terrible about yourself, well, that's not true humility. True humility has to be paired with complete, unwavering trust and confidence in the divine. Recognizing you are nothing is only half the equation. The other half is trusting that God is everything. She visualizes this relationship using the imagery of a shadow and the sun. comparing the soul to the shadow and God to the sun. Think about it for a second. A shadow has zero independent existence. It only exists and moves because the dazzling light of the sun is hitting an object. The second the sun shifts, the shadow changes. If the light goes out, the shadow vanishes entirely. Lucia sees her soul as utterly dependent on the mystical sun of the divine for its very existence. To push this idea of reliance even further, she uses this fascinating 19th century analogy, the steamer ship. When you board a huge steamer ship, you don't have to take a single step of your own to cross the ocean. You just stay on the ship, blindly following its trajectory, and the ship's massive engine does all the work. She explains that by yielding our own will entirely and placing ourselves in God, we are carried effortlessly forward to sublime heights of perfection. It's 100% his power, not ours. Now, I should point out, this diary isn't just full of peaceful, comforting analogies. The tone of her entries frequently shifts to something much darker and far more frightening. She records these solemn, terrifying visions of global chastisements. The text details visions of divine justice sweeping the earth, contagious diseases, destructive hail, and a terrifying cup of blood literally threatening humanity. She reports that Jesus shows her these apocalyptic scenes as the inevitable result of humanity's rampant sins, ingratitude, and deep-seated hypocrisy. And that actually brings us to the emotional climax of her intimate memoir. Faced with these terrifying visions of destruction, she doesn't hide. She steps right into the gap with a fierce, completely selfless plea. She says, "Pour your bitternesses into me," or rather, "Pour the chastisements upon this sinner, for I deserve them." She literally begs to absorb the divine punishment into her own body and soul just to spare humanity, and specifically to spare her own town of Corrado. She offers herself as a total victim of substitution. This substitution builds into a visceral, mystical exchange of suffering. The text describes this process incredibly intimately. Step 1, she draws near to his side. Step 2, she drinks what starts out as the sweet milk of divine love. But then step 3, she willingly accepts the intense, agonizing bitterness of the world's sins and the pending justice. She shares intimately in both his divine sweetness and the excruciating pain he feels for a broken world. And through all of this intense suffering, she receives a profound realization about the nature of the cross. The text really emphasizes the number one here. There is only one cross. Now, it might be made of various different pieces of wood, representing the different types of suffering we all endure. But ultimately, it is one singular cross, and it leads to one unified heaven. Suffering, in her view, isn't just random bad luck. It's the specific, precious wood used to build our place in eternity. But what actually causes the greatest suffering? Surprisingly, she notes it isn't always the obvious, loud, worldly sins. It's hypocrisy. The text neutrally reports Jesus' profound sorrow over those who perform holy works, attend Mass, and act devoutly, but do it for selfish esteem or with poison in their hearts. These poisoned works pierce his heart the most deeply because they come from his own followers. It's a really stark reminder that purity of intention, doing things solely for love, stripped of all ego, is all that truly matters. But right in the middle of all this chalk of bitterness and hypocrisy, we find this incredible arc back toward peace. Sweetness has the virtue of making things change their nature. It knows well how to convert bitter into sweet. This brilliantly illustrates how divine love actually operates in her life. It fundamentally transforms her paralyzing fear and her intense physical suffering into profound tranquility. The bitterness of the world is completely neutralized by the overwhelming sweetness of divine intimacy. And for anyone who fully embraces this life, who swims in faith, as she puts it, she details 3 spiritual joys. First, penetrating the things of God with absolute clarity. Second, actually feeling a deep boredom for purely earthly material things. And third, experiencing a total detachment from everything. This isn't some depressing emptiness, though. Rather, she explains that this total detachment is exactly what makes room for the most profound, naked spiritual joy. Ultimately, this turbulent diary of visions, fears, and apocalyptic warnings finds its resolution in pure love, ending with a very soft, concluding promise. I keep you in the shadow of my charity. My love keeps you concealed, everywhere and in everything. This is the ultimate resolution to Luisa's internal struggle. She realizes that despite her feelings of nothingness and despite all the horrors of the world, she is safely and eternally enveloped in an endless ocean of love. Which leaves us with one final thought to ponder today. We've seen a soul wrestle with her own unworthiness, face absolute terror, and ultimately surrender entirely. So the question remains for us. When faced with a call to completely abandon our own ego, will we choose the courage of love over our deepest personal fears? I'll leave you to reflect on that. Thanks for joining me on this explainer of the source material, and keep seeking to understand the profound depths of the world around and within you.